Welcome to our third Life Science Cafe of 2022. My name is Katie Schrader, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. I'm going to be tonight's host. Life Science Cafe got started back in 2011 and is organized by graduate student researchers at UMass. Each month, we invite experts to share and discuss their research with us. And typically we host these events in person in the Amherst community, but we have been continuing our efforts virtually since the start of the pandemic. We would like to thank our funders, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program, the Graduate Student Senate, and the Graduate School at UMass, the National Science Foundation, and our generous UMass Gives donors. Please subscribe to our mailing list and stay tuned for future cafes that we will be having. So this academic year, we have been celebrating our 10th anniversary with special speakers. Our topic tonight is extreme evolution, taking traits to their limit, but maybe a more fitting title might add, taking it to the limit one more time, because tonight's speaker was also our very first ever Science Cafe guest. So we're very happy to have Dr. Podos back to talk about bird ecology and evolution. Dr. Jeff Podos has been a biology professor at UMass since 2000, but he also periodically teaches graduate student workshops at the National Institute of Amazon Research in Brazil. Jeff's research on vocal behavior in birds has taken him through multiple countries in the Americas, and we are going to hear all about that in the next hour. So welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, Katie. Took a second to figure out how to unmute and all that.
That's right. All right, so actually, our very first question of the night is not for Jeff, but for our audience. So we're going to be starting with an interactive poll. So just like the check-in poll when you came in, please read the question and choose which answer. So we're asking, which one of these things do you think sounds as loud as the white bellbird? And I'll just clarify that that is when you are standing right next to this thing, because of course, if you're farther away, it's going to not be as loud, right? So I'll give you a few more moments to choose your answer. And then we will hear the correct answer. All right, I'm going to end. And let's see what you all said. So it was split about 50-50 with our loudest two answers, Jackhammer and ambulance siren. But Jeff, can you tell us what the correct answer is?
Well, it's actually a tricky question for a couple of reasons, as is true for almost anything that we do in science. So first of all, it depends on how far away you are from the jackhammer or the siren, because of course, the farther you are away, it's the less loud it sounds. So this is a standardized measure. And so the answer actually, it could be either one of these, because it depends on which measure of amplitude you're going to use. It's a curveball. So if you're using average maximum amplitude versus peak maximal amplitude, it could be either one of them. So you all win. Congratulations.
All right, way to go, everybody.
Actually, before we even start, I just want to mention why I was the first person to speak at the OEB Science Cafe, back when it was called OEB Science Cafe. And it wasn't because of anything special that I've been doing. It's just because my PhD student, Sarah Goodwin, was the one who instituted the whole thing. And so she hosted the very first meeting at the Essalon Cafe. And I noticed one of the check-in poll questions was, is this your very first Science Cafe? And if you had taken that poll back then, it would have been everyone's very first Science Cafe. And I remember it fondly because it was interrupted by this very heavy thunderstorm. And for a little while, I had to be screaming at the top of my lungs like a very loud bird in order to be heard. And at the end of the night, I had a pretty good sore throat. The other thing to say too is that I know the subtitle of the theme this year is Where Are They Now? And you've been featuring people who have been at UMass but then left. And so you might have seen, oh, I didn't realize Jeff was gone. And the actual fact is that I'm like a bad meal. I stick around. I'm still here. So that's my preamble.
Yes, so definitely this cafe is a throwback instead of, inviting back a former committee member. Absolutely. So Jeff, so you study animal communication. So we know we're gonna at some point get to those really loud birds, but can you tell me what animal communication studies entails? So how are animals really talking to each other?
Sure. So I talk a lot about animal communication in the class on animal behavior that I teach. So one of the courses that I get to teach at UMass, and it's really fun. It's for 48 seniors. It's usually people at the very end of their biology major. And we cover all aspects of animal behavior. And animal communication is really just what I view as a subset of what we learn from animal behavior. Basically, animals have evolved to take advantage of all sorts of possible ways that they can gain advantages from. So they evolve through natural selection to optimize their capacity to survive and to reproduce. And so communication comes about in animals because animals tend to be mobile and highly social. And there are opportunities that arise over evolution for them to establish communication signals that enhance their own lot in life, basically. So communication is what we're doing now. It's when there's an individual that produces some sort of energy. We think of them as signals, and it could be visual, acoustic, tactile, chemical, or there's one there that I missed. Well, chemicals actually is olfactory and taste. So those are the major senses. But anyway, it can be along those channels, and basically an organism can generate energy in that channel in a way that will be detected by other animals and will influence the way that those animals behave. And often it's to coordinate interactions among individuals. So there's a lot of things that there's a lot of angles that one can address animal communication from. You can look at the physiology of how that works. There's a lot of questions about signal detection and signal generation. There's question about perceptual capacities. How does an animal know or detect signals from other organisms? Sometimes they have very specialized organs that allow them to do that. Sometimes the channels are quite private. It's hard for us to detect. Often we can ask about the benefits, the value of the communication, but it fits into the broader scheme of animals that have evolved to enhance their lots in life.
So this is all, really interesting. And it's kind of weird to think about, how to communicate without language, because that's mostly how we do it as humans, right? But I'm thinking about, animals that have to do things without, formally talking to each other like we do. Like, there's frogs that wave to each other, and that means a certain thing to another frog. So how did these different signals actually come into existence so that, the other frog knows what this wave means?
Strangely enough, I actually have some slides that I could show, and it wouldn't be about frogs, but it would be about electric communication in fish. And it's just sort of a crazy coincidence that I happen to have some slides. Let me see if I can figure out how to project them, because it's always a challenge in the world of Zoom. So I'm going to share my screen here.
With sound if you need it.
With sound, thank you. And so hopefully you can see that.
Yes.
Okay. And there's no Zoom stuff in front of it, because there is on my screen.
Nope.
Okay, excellent. So I want to talk I have 3 slides here about this really cool fish that is called an electric fish it's a new species that was described by researchers at UMass. So including Professor Christina Cox-Fernandez, who's in our biology department. And let me show you a photo of her. So for 5 years, Christina took students from UMass, lucky students from UMass, down to the Amazon rainforest. And here they are on top of a tower near the city of Manaus. There's Christina on the left. And these are 15 lucky UMass students that got to spend 2 weeks on a boat going up and down the river. anyway, these Amazon waters are filled with really interesting fishes. They're called knife fishes. And they are also known as electric fish. And so what they do, here's a picture of one, a live one in a tank somewhere. It's called a knife fish or electric fish. And they're very poorly understood by people because the main modality with which they communicate is through electric signals. So for example, this fish, if you were able to put an electromagnetic detector into the water, you would be able to detect a polarity that's generated. There's a voltage signal that's generated by cells inside the fish. And it uses this electric field, which is something that is really hard for us to even describe. The fish uses that and it sends out signals. It sends out information about its particular state or motivation that can be read by other fish. So other fishes have, well, all the fishes actually have detectors, a detection system that's different from the electro-generating system. And you can, as one fish, you can read what's going on with the other fish. And so if a fish is feeling pretty aggressive, or if there's some change in its state, it can be detected. So that's communication. Now, I wanted to raise this example, not only because it's so ridiculously cool, but because it is really fascinating to think where this came from. You know, why do electric fishes do this and where did that come from? And this is an evolutionary question. And so there's a couple of lessons we can learn by thinking about electric fish. The first one is we would potentially ask, why electricity? Why are these animals using electrical signals? And the fundamental answer is because they had this capacity available to them deep from their evolutionary history, because like every other animal, fishes have neurons, and neurons work through electrical conduction. And so every animal is electrically active. We don't have really enough voltage to work with electric fields, so it doesn't make sense for it to evolve in most creatures. But something happened in the early evolution of electric fish where some of their neurons, and actually in some species, some of their muscle cells, which are also electrically active, they had a change in the distribution of ion channels on the surface of their cells, which basically all the ion channels on one side became deactivated, the others became activated. What this really meant is that electricity could move quickly through one side of the cell and not through the other, which basically polarized the cell. It turned it into a tiny little battery. And then if you put them all into series, you can generate a detectable signal. And so all of a sudden, you are generating these signals. Well, they're not signals yet until they're detected. So with the availability now of electricity, electrical fields, there were some of these ancestral fish that then evolved the capacity to read them, to receive the information. And there's actually quite a lot of fish, different species like sharks, that have electroreceptors. So it's an old perceptual system. But these animals were then able to read their own electric fields. And so probably the first function, the first reason this was useful to fish was for navigation, because they're in the Amazon, a lot of the rivers are muddy and you really can't use your eyes. You can see how small the eye is on that fish. You can't really use typical hearing very well. You need some sort of mechanism to be able to move through the environment. And that's what it was. It's electric fields that evolved for navigation. So very useful for the fish to be able to produce an electric signal and read its own signal. And if it's coming close to a leaf, there's a perturbation in the electric field, which then is read by the fish. Now once that was in place, that sets up the possibility for communication. Because if every fish now can read its own signals, its own electrical fields, that means it's now positioned to read other fish's electrical fields. And so that's the next step. And what would be the advantage of doing that? Well, you can suss out the motivation, the plans for other fishes that are coming towards you or moving away from you. And if you, for example, are a female electric fish and you're looking for a mate, maybe you can get information about that male based on its electric signal. So for example, a larger fish might produce a higher voltage signal. And so this is the last step, and this is where I think you're going with this, Katie, is you can potentially get information in the structure of signals. And if you can perceive that and process that, and you can make decisions on that, it's to your advantage, and you will be favored through natural selection. So for example, if you are swimming around and you detect a super high voltage signal, then you might know that that's a larger individual coming towards you, and you can modulate your behavior accordingly. The signal predicts the state of the individual with whom you're going to interact. So that's all I really wanted to show for the slides for the moment. So if I can figure out how to do this, I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah, so that's really cool. It's this like really long, slow, iterative process of, adding the next step and the next step and so on. You're still screen sharing, but we can see your desktop, just so you know.
Yes, I know. I'm just trying to figure out how do I close out of this.
There should still be a green button at the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, I know. I don't see any of the Zoom stuff at all.
Well, you can keep sharing for now.
Okay, let's do that. Yeah.
So I'm curious then, so it makes sense how these things would evolve to communicate within the same species, but what about if somehow you could pick up on the signals of other species and that might benefit you? Does that happen and how common is that?
So yeah, that's right. So the layers of complexity upon which one can build in terms of signals, once you have signals adapted into a new system, then you can move in all sorts of crazy directions. And so we've known for a long time, and this has been something that probably predated a lot of communication through signals, is that it's really useful for some animals to detect the presence of others. So for example, one of the first things that most animals had to deal with once they were sort of recently evolved is to get food or to avoid getting eaten. Because the whole thing about being an animal is that you can't produce your own food. So you have to go after it, which means other animals are potentially going after you too. And so you have the very early evolution of sensory systems that will benefit you if you can differentiate things in your environment. So the classic would be acoustic perception in owls that are so good you can hear the little pitter patter of mice running underfoot. Pretty amazing. So if you are now communicating, you're sending now information, and you're sending information for your advantage. You're trying to change the behavior of other animals around you. You might also run into some sort of disadvantage. And the disadvantage would come in the fact that you're now becoming revealed, your presence, your whereabouts, your status is being revealed to things that might want to eat you. Or you might be giving up your location to prey you're trying to follow and trying to find. So there's all sorts of examples of animals tapping in to the signal energy from other species and using that to their advantage. So a really good example, and we talk about this in the animal behavior class, is that there are these frogs called Tungura frogs. And in that species, it's the males who are singing, and they have this really cool multi-parted call. And it's to their advantage when they're looking for mates to produce more complicated, more complex, more conspicuous calls. But the problem is that if you do that too well, then you are revealing your whereabouts to hungry frog-eating bats. And so really ultimately it becomes this trade-off where you want to be able to communicate, but you don't want to risk dying in the process. And so you end up with all these sort of ecological trade-offs between the function of signaling and all these other challenges that you face in your life. It's really hard to be an animal. Actually, it's hard to be any sort of organism, but animals, they're constantly on the run, either after prey or trying to avoid getting eaten. And then you overlay the challenges of integrating within social groups, and that can be pretty complicated. And so communication signals come about as a way to sort of mediate their capacity to do that well, but things can get in the way.
Yeah, this whole field is really interesting. So I do want to stop there and invite everybody to add any questions that they have at this point into the Q&A function. Alternatively, again, you can also click on that raise hand button and we will call on you. But while we're waiting, so again, please add your questions into the Q&A. While we're waiting, I'm gonna ask one more question, Jeff. So how is it that we've got all of these different methods of communication in animals, and what is it really that determines, which things are most common? Like, why don't we have more electric fish?
Yeah, well, that's a very deep question, and it's a question about evolution. And so evolution, first of all, it's full of contingency. So Why don't we have more electric fish? Well, that might have to do with the geography of the rivers in which they have evolved, or something about the need to have a certain degree of salinity of water to have electrical signal conduction work. So you can have limitations in terms of habitats. Another big answer to that is that there are going to be different species that emphasize different perceptual capacities. So for example, there's a lot of mammals and insects that are heavily olfactory in their lifestyles. They might live underground or in the dark, and they're really keen to use olfactory information to learn about food and to learn about other things. And that then becomes an opportunity for them to evolve olfactory communication. And you know that if you just walk your dog, the dog is so interested in reading P-mails and sending their own P-mails. And we can't sense that at all. Every organism has its own capacities. And there's also different advantages to different kinds of signals. So like, for example, if you are doing acoustic signaling, that's great in the dark, and it's great if you're signaling over long distances or you want to reach multiple individuals at the same time, but it doesn't last. It's totally ephemeral. Whereas if you want to have a lasting signal, it might be good to do scent marking. Visual signaling is great when there's light. It's not great when it's dark. And so there's all sorts of variations, and it's what's amazing is how the sensory modalities map onto the opportunities that life gives for all these different creatures.
Cool. So we have some questions rolling in the Q&A. So the first one is from Oren, kind of asking about that trade-off that you talked about earlier. So don't male birds run the same risk of becoming too beautiful and attracting the wrong kind of attention? So it's more risk than benefit. And I think we're going to get to that maybe even a little bit more soon, but if you want to kind of foreshadow that, Jeff.
Yeah, hi, Oren. So yes, so evolution can go bonkers, can go in directions where maybe you are going to be emphasizing one of the solutions you have in the face of challenges. So if you are, for example, a male bird of certain species, like the peacock, when you are trying to attract a mate, it turns out that the more ridiculously ornamented you are, the better off you're going to be able to do in terms of mating. But if you go too far overboard, then you might be more susceptible to getting tracked down by a predator that can catch you now because you can't really fly with that ridiculously long train on your tail. So yeah, we will get back to this.
Yeah, so actually, I'm going to, in the interest of time, move on. We're going to get to some of the other questions that we have in the next round, but that one perfectly leads into what I was going to ask about first next, which is basically, the same thing. So in some circumstances, as you were just saying, it seems like it's beneficial for, in some cases, right, it's the male to like look a certain way or act a certain way to signal their quality, right? But cardinals are really bright, and they're not getting even brighter. And peacocks have really big tails, but the tails aren't continuing to get bigger. So is that part of the same thing? That's this trade-off? Like, are there limits to where these things can go in, it's not just indefinite?
Yes. So what you're getting at there, Katie, is a distinction that we make between what we call costs and what we call constraints. And as animal behaviorists, as people studying the behavior, the communication signals of animals, we're borrowing those terms from people who have used it in other evolutionary studies. So for example, paleontologists who are interested in deep evolution of organisms often make this distinction between costs and constraints. So I'll try to explain this. So there are certain things that you do as an organism, your behavior, when it's communication, sometimes the more you communicate, the more effective that signal is going to be. So if you're trying to track down a mate, let's say you're a frog, the more you call, then the more likely you are to draw in a mating partner. And so you might think that it would make sense to then just keep calling all the time, as much as you can. But when you look in nature, you see that animals tend to use their discretion actually when they're signaling. They tend to be somewhat careful about how they do that. It's not pedal to the metal, spinal tap number 11 all the time. Now, why is that? Well, it could be because of costs or constraints. And so costs refer to the effects of doing too much. So if you're going to basically start calling a lot, you could harm yourself in other ways. And this is a kind of trade-off. So the peacock example I gave, where if you're too flamboyant, then you hurt your ability to fly a little bit, you can get caught. The cost comes in you getting eaten in a predator. In those frogs that call too much and get eaten by frog-eating bats, that's a cost as well. It's in frogs, there are some frogs like gray tree frogs that have been studied. If they call all night for multiple days in a row, they can lose like 30% of their body weight, which can be pretty devastating for other things that they want to achieve in life. Now, the other idea is called constraint, and it's kind of related in some way. There's a gray line between the two ideas, but the constraint idea is that there are going to be some phenotypes that even if you would want to produce them, you might be stuck because of your body plan or because limits in your ability to generate the resources to grow or to do the behavior. So for example, you could not imagine a peacock growing a tail that's twice the size of the peacock tail that you see now. There's just no way that you can do that within the limits of the way that peacocks operate, right? They can only take in so much food per unit time. There's a process for growing the tails. And so it's really interesting to think about both of these things because they have different implications for the evolution of communication. So the fact that signals can be costly, it actually sets up a mechanism by which their content, the information transmitted, becomes honest and becomes relevant for the listener. So if, for example, I'm a peacock and I'm able to generate a relatively large tail, larger than other males around me, then females can look at me and say, and not literally say, but they can infer, or they can act as if they infer. They can be selected to act as if they know. They don't actually have to know that, oh, that male over there, there's something good about him because he was able to devote enough resources to grow that tail. And look, he's here, he's displaying. And I want some of that. I want some of those genes in my babies. And so she might be favored to then mate with that sort of male. So the theory of reliability and honesty in signaling is linked very closely to the idea that signals can be costly, especially when they're very elaborate. In terms of constraints, then you just can't get there. There are going to be some phenotypes where you just can't get there. And I think that the constraints are more indicative of other topics, such as how body size and body plan and morphology and bits of the organism that's evolving, how evolution in those structures can drive the evolution of signals in specific ways. And we'll be getting to that later on this evening.
So when we're looking at these animals, then how do we know that the signal has reached its limit? How do we know that there's been, some sort of cost or constraint acting on it?
Yeah, so this is something that I've been interested in for a long time. This was kind of the topic of my talk 10 years ago. You remember it? No, I'm just kidding. But what I can do is I have some slides to share, and hopefully the transition will go better here this time. And I just want to talk about this idea of constraints. And actually it relates not just to constraints, but to the origin to what signals are, to what signals involve. Because often if you read about signals in the literature, they're modeled as something that's static. So let's say the length of a peacock tail or the brightness of a peacock tail. And there's all these models out there, especially for sexual selection, that basically tries to draw correlations between certain genetic properties and the degree to which a signal is exaggerated, and also preferences of females for those traits. But the reality is that a lot of signaling involves animals doing stuff. It's not just a static thing, but it's animal behavior, animals expressing their things about their capacity to do stuff in a way that can be really revealing. So let's try again here. Share screen. All right, so there's the peacock. And are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the peacock is sort of, if you read about it, what's important is the length of the tail and the number of eye spots. But if you really watch peacocks, and there have been a number of studies fairly recently that have looked at peacocks and say, well, how does a male actually try to attract a female? And he does all this stuff behaviorally. He spreads out he fans his feathers, and he does this shaking of the feathers, which basically makes the eye spots glisten. And this is a theme that shows up over and over again in animal signaling. So there's the peacock. This shows a before and after, actually before and during images of a certain bird from Brazil, from the neotropics, called the grassquit, blue-black grassquit, which is a project that I've worked on with Brazilian researchers for a number of years, where this is the male and he's signaling, he jumps up into the air, sort of leans over and shows white, you can't really see that too well here, but he shows little white spots on his shoulders and lands, and he keeps doing this over and over again. Now, if you just looked at the bird in the museum, you would say it's probably about the color and the white spots, but really it's about the action of doing stuff that becomes pretty important. And I'm telling you this because this is really important for constraints. Okay, so let's see, I got some other examples. So there's a really cool research project being done by a collaboration of people. They're working in Panama on the golden collared mannequin. And these mannequins, they have these incredible displays where they dance around. And the research team has found that males who can do the fanciest and most prolific dances at a very fine scale, variations among males that we can only detect using high-speed video, that males who do this a little bit quicker and more completely are the ones that the females like. So females are very focused on these capacities. There's also work on hermit crabs that fight with each other. This is a tree frog. We already talked about tree frogs. Where does the signal come from? Well, we have been arguing that the coloration and like the fancy colors, that all comes later. That's built on the motor patterns, which are more basic, because behavior can be really revealing. It's a better place, better venue in which a female can potentially suss out differences that are meaningful among different males. Here's one other example. These are pronghorn, and pronghorn are super interesting in terms of their mating systems because they will run around, and the females basically will let males chase them. And most of the time the males can't catch the females, but if the male's able to catch the female, then she deems him a sufficient mate. And so she'll let him mate. So it's almost like an Olympic contest, but it's for mating. It's not to go up on the podium. Anyhow, let me give you one other example because we're going to build on this example. We're going to switch to birds now, and we're going to talk about swamp sparrows, which is a species that we've been studying here at UMass for a long time. Katie is doing work on them. And there's a swamp sparrow with food in its beak. It's got babies in a nest. There's another picture. I can't get anyone to look at my pictures, so now you're stuck looking at them. Anyhow, here's an image. We got some audio here. Here's an image of 3 different songs that swamp sparrows sing. This is actually from a New York population, but similar songs around here. And you can see that the songs have, these are spectrograms. We read them like a musical score from left to right. And if you listen to the songs, you can also look at them. You can hear variations in how quickly the notes are repeated. That one's a little slower. That one's a little faster. And the more we look at birds singing, the more we realize that these songs are also performance limited, that it's really hard for these birds to sing the very fastest. And they probably run into constraints at the upper end. And this is what my PhD thesis was about. Basically, we took young birds and we raised them with songs that were super fast, and we were able to show that they were unable to copy them in ways that were really indicating they were stuck. So where's the constraint? Why does this play a role for these birds? Well, when these birds are singing, they're doing all sorts of activity. They're opening and closing their beaks. They're breathing in and out. They're using their respiratory muscles. They've got the syrinx, the sound production organ, deep inside them. So it's this symphony of activity. And it's just really hard to accelerate that beyond a certain point. Okay.
This is really interesting. So on the topic of extreme bird songs, let's go back to that poll at the beginning. So you work with these really loud birds called bellbirds. So this is definitely an extreme signal. So do you have a video that you can show us of like what this sounds like?
I do. Let me just give a very thumbnail. So we studied these birds. We went right before the pandemic, fortunately, we went up to the top of this mountain. I went with my collaborator, Mario Cohnhaft, who works at the National Institute for Amazon Research. And he and his students have been going to far-flung places around the Amazon. And one expedition up a mountain, he came back and said, "Hey, Jeff, we got all these white bellbirds. How loud did they sing?" And we looked into it and we realized that we hadn't seen, there had been no documentation of how loud those birds sang. So we mounted a couple of expeditions to go up this mountain and study them. And so I have to show just a couple of images of what it was like going to this location, because this is in the back is the quote unquote hotel in which we flew. And Brazilians are nothing if not creative, figuring out how to get the horse going around. There's the mountain in the back that we scaled. Here is a road there's a bridge that we had to go over in order to get to the field site. And we had a group of local agricultural workers that basically we were scaling this mountain, Amazon on top of a mountain. So mixing a bunch of different habitats in a really crazy way. Here's a bunch of Mario students. These are all ornithology experts. Amazing. I learned a ton from them. So here are pictures of the birds we were going after. These are white bellbirds, otherwise known as Amazon bellbirds. The male is here. It's got a sort of flamboyant dress, so it looks kind of different. It's got this weird doohickey, that's the official term, not really, hanging from its beak. It looks like a lizard tail. This is the female. So this is a case where the females have evolved to be more sensibly dressed. They're more cryptic. They don't want to be found, whereas the males are competing with each other to try to convince females that they're worth mating with. And so one of the things they do is they sing super loud. And I've got a video for you. You might have seen it before. It has been seen like 5 million times, last count on YouTube. You might want to turn down your speaker a little bit. That's the sound of the top of that mountain right there. So that's a second type, and the male does this really cool swivel thing. Which
Sounds
is really,
so weird.
Coatengas, this is a kind of Coatenga, and Coatengas are nothing if not super weird. They really are. So you might have a lot of questions now that you've seen that. One of the questions might be, what limits them, or how do they produce that? Well, actually, Katie, you're the one asking the questions, so I won't ask the question. Sorry.
No, that's certainly one of my questions. I'm also wondering if the females even like this, what is going on? And if it's really loud, like, where is she? Is she like miles away listening to this saying, oh,
so these
the guy I
birds,
like.
they have very distant areas. So they're definitely interacting with each other, the males, but the females are definitely interested in what the male is doing. And so we had some observations. When we went there, we didn't think we would see the females, but we saw on occasion females basically approaching the males as they're on the singing perch. And then this really cool thing happens where the male will adopt a very specific posture where he faces away from the female. The female gets right next to him. And then he does the most outrageous thing that I've ever seen a bird do, where he sings that second song type, that super loud song type. He sings the first note away, and then he swivels around as if he's like an opera star, and just sort of puffing his chest, and sings this second ridiculously loud, as the loudest bird note in the world documented so far, right in the face of the female, although she knows what's going on, so she flies away. It doesn't seem like the female likes that. And it seems like the male has very poor social skills.
But then why does she sit right next to him if she knows he's gonna do it?
I just don't know. It doesn't make any sense. So maybe she's trying to provoke him to do this. I think maybe she's not so interested in how loud the song is anymore, because they're all so loud. Maybe she's trying to figure out how socially adept he is, or actually comparing the degree of inadeptness of how lousy these males are, maybe going for the least worst. I don't know. We got to get back to this mountain and figure this out.
That's really interesting. You got to tell us if you find out more about the female, but what do you know about the male so far? How is he able to sing this really loud song?
So he's got all sorts of very specific adaptations that you can look at morphologically that seem like they would drive his capacity to sing loudly. So one thing, it's the most obvious place to look, there's the sound organ, it's called the syrinx, and birds have it, other animals don't, that's buried deep inside the bird. And most syringes, the plural syringe, of syrinx is syringe, most syringes are really small, they're minuscule. Whereas in this case of the bellbird, it's like this giant muscle. And so that suggests that the bird has to really stretch the membrane really tight in order to generate the loud pulses. There's also very thickened abdominal musculature. And if you watch the bird sing, it kind of squeezes its body, which is probably pushing air very quickly. Now, the other thing that I want to mention here that I think is really cool, and we'd love to go back and study this more, is that the birds also open their beaks really, really widely when they sing. And you might have seen that from the video. We think that that probably is a key adaptation that allows them to produce the song. And there's a specific musical acoustic reason why having your beak open very widely could allow you to generate loud sounds. I'll just say that if you look at a lot of musical instruments like a trombone or a trumpet, the horn, the bell actually at the end of the tube has a similar sort of morphology, and that's for radiating loud sounds too. And so why do bellbirds sing loudly? I think it's because it can open the beak so widely. And then you might ask, why does the beak open so widely? And there's an ecological reason, which is the bellbirds are fruit eating. Most birds aren't. Most birds eat insects or seeds, but in the case of bellbirds, they eat fruit. And one of the adaptations that has been in place for fruit eating is the ability to open the beak really widely and actually to evolve a broad internal gullet that allows you to swallow fruit. What they do is they pluck fruit, sometimes while hovering, grab fruit, fly back to a perch, swallow it into their crop, and just basically sit there digesting the fruit. Eventually, they regurgitate the seed out. So the morphology, this is in the constraint area. The morphology basically shapes the beak. Actually, it's not a constraint. It's more like providing a new opportunity to go in this crazy direction.
Okay, so that's a really interesting concept, and I want to come back to that in just a minute, but I'm going to pause for a few more questions from our audience, and we've got some more rolling in, so please add more questions as you have them. So we just got one on the bellbirds from Emily. So Emily wants to know if the bellbird can actually damage its own hearing.
We don't know, but fortunately we have fairly recent studies on roosters. So roosters crow really loudly, and they're not as loud as a bellbird, we would think. They're not, but they're still loud enough where you would wonder, how is it that the rooster is able to not hurt its own hearing? And it turns out that there's a physiological mechanical adaptation inside the ear. As the jaw opens for the rooster to crow, that somehow interacts with the inner ear bones and it disconnects them. So you don't get the vibrations that are coming to the ear transmitted to the cochlea, which is the acoustic processing, where the sensory cells are for hearing. So I would presume that male bellbirds have something like that as well. A real question we don't know is, what about the female? Because the female is pretty close by and she's not singing. So maybe she has some way of dealing with this. It's an unknown. We would love to look into the ears of some of these bellbirds and see if we can see anything distinct about the morphology.
Yes, that would be really cool. So let's see, we've got some questions kind of harkening back to our general discussion on animal communication in general. So Lynette wants to know if animals can purposefully send false signals.
So Lynette, hi. So that's a long-standing question, and there's been debate about that. It was pretty hot debate in the 70s. Where we have come to think about on that particular question is that, yes, animals can on occasion send false signals to their own advantage. So if you find a way to cheat in your interaction, you can do that. But if you do that too much, then the perceivers, the signal receivers, are going to lose faith in you. They're going to recognize that you are not reliable, and then they will stop paying attention to you. And basically, if everyone in the population continues to send false signals, then the signal will cease to be a signal. No one will pay attention to it at all. And so this is really the big question. How do we maintain signals? They have to be reliable. And then this feeds back to, where does the reliability come from? And one place that it can come from, if signals are costly, then they sort of automatically become reliable, and it maintains their honesty. It's an endlessly fascinating question to discuss, though.
Definitely. And then let's do one more question before we move on. We're going to do another question session at the end, so don't worry if you haven't gotten your questions answered yet. So we had a question in the chat. Sarah wanted to know, is there any data that suggests if humans are affecting animal signals?
Oh, yes. So the way to study that is to do a close examination of the structure of signals. And so what do I mean by the structure? You can look, for example, at, let's say, a visual signal. You can look at something like the color. And by the color, you can break it down to the components, to the saturation and the hue and the reflectance. If you're doing acoustic signaling, then you can record those signals and you can look at these parameters that you can really measure, things like frequency and timing and amplitude. So basically for olfactory signals, you can look at the chemical compositions. And so if you have baseline information, let's say pre-interaction with people on those parameters, and then you look at animals that are now interacting with people, let's say in an urban environment, or you can compare animals in urban environments to rural environments, and you look at those parameters and you can look and see whether or not there's any effect. So there's been a number of studies, there's a lot of interest in this. In the acoustic realm, for example, there's now very good evidence that a lot of species that have moved into urban environments, or I should say people have moved into the birds' environments as the cities have grown, the amount of noise in the city is pretty dramatic, coming from cars and so forth. That tends to be low frequency sound, and birds tend to be pretty high pitched. But if a bird is singing in the same frequency range as the traffic noise, then you tend to see a shift in the frequencies of their songs. They evolve to emphasize the higher frequencies, basically moving towards a more private channel. In visual systems, there are fish that live in crystalline ponds where they're brightly colored, but sometimes the ponds where they live become polluted, where it becomes hard for them to see each other. And in that case, you see changes in the coloration of these fishes. It doesn't make sense anymore to produce bright colorations if other fish can't see them. And so they tend to evolve to lose some of those colors. And there's a bunch of other examples. Thanks for the question, Sarah. Very good.
Is there anything that humans don't affect? My goodness.
There used to be.
So, okay, so I want to go back to where we ended that last section. So you said that the really large, wide gape of the bellbird is potentially an adaptation to eat the foods that it eats, but also that it helps it sing really loud, potentially. So this seems like a case where, the mouth, the beak itself has these two different functions, and maybe it helps the bellbird if it's big for both of those functions. But what about if there's kind of competing functions where, the size or the shape should be adapted to look different and for different functions?
Well, yeah, I mean, so let's think about the bellbird for a second, right? So the bellbird beak basically has evolved for feeding. That's undoubtedly the initial function of the beak. It's to allow the animal to procure food, right? It's you go back to the fishy ancestry of birds, because birds are just fish, as are people, as are all vertebrates. We're all just fish, and birds are fish with feathers, and fishes use their mouths to eat. So eating is primary. And so you've got the beaks. The beaks evolve towards different kinds of morphologies and functions based on food. And that can then provide opportunities for evolution in other functions of the same structure. So if the beak is involved in singing in the way that we were talking about, then one could affect the other and it can have all these downstream effects. There's another example that I'll talk about, which is actually much more well-known in the biology world, which has to do with Darwin's finches. So you've probably seen this image. This is a famous image from Darwin's, it was actually the 6th edition of his book, The Voyage of the Beagle, where he described his experiences and his observations of his world travels on the ship. And it included a stop in the Galapagos, and he and his team collected a bunch of different birds on the Galapagos Islands. And sort of famously, at the time in the Galapagos, he didn't realize that they were all the same group. He looked at this bird, that was like a grosbeak, and this bird, it looks like a finch from England. This looks like a sparrow. This looks like a warbler. So he didn't really think much of that. But when he returned to England, he was basically told by the ornithologist, by the curator of birds at the British Museum of Natural History, that, hey, these things, they all have some things in common with each other. There's weird things about the number of scales on the feet and the number of feathers. And also, they were all new to science. They hadn't been seen before. And this is a very important moment in Darwin's history, because that's really where he conceptualized the ideas about evolution and descent with modification and natural selection. It all sort of stemmed from that. So anyway, we all learn about Darwin's finches in middle school and high school and college biology. And a lot of times the things that we learn have to do with beaks as a consequence of a process, right? So the birds are going to different locations, different islands, and on these different islands, they're encountering different kinds of foods. And basically then the population will evolve through natural selection or through competition with other species to the point where the beaks become very fine-tuned as processors for the food available. So this is a species that has adapted, has specialized to feed and crushing hard seeds, whereas this species might be more about probing into crevices to look for insect larvae. And that's a story that should sound sort of familiar. To answer your question, one way to think about that is that, hey, we know the beak actually is not just about feeding. So with work done for the last 30 or 40 years, we've been able to see how using the beak during song actually helps the birds to sing musical sounds, to sound really nice. So if a bird is going to switch between frequencies, going from low pitch to high pitch at the syrinx, then it's going to open and close its beak in a way that basically allows it to maintain the tonal purity of the sound. And again, we could talk about musical acoustics. There's some really clear analogies there. And so anyway, I got to thinking about this as a finishing PhD student, and I started working on this as a postdoc, where I wanted to know, are the beaks not just a consequence, but also a cause? Can we continue the causal arrow to singing? And so I did my very first field season in the Galapagos back in 1999. I never thought I would get there at all, actually, but I got there once, and then that turned into 15 research trips to the Galapagos. But let me just show you one figure from the research. And we got lots of figures, but this is just the one I'm going to show you from the very first study that I published on this. These are 8 different species of Darwin's finches that we caught and banded and measured their beaks, and then recorded their songs on one of the islands in 2 populations. And basically, again, I can play these songs. Let's compare the songs of these 3 different species at the top. This is the large, medium, and small ground finch. The medium ground finch is kind of the poster child for evolution. That's the one that you read about if you're reading about Darwin's finches. They've been studied with great detail by Peter and Rosemary Grant. So anyway, if we look at these 3 species, we see that these birds sing songs that are kind of like swamp sparrows, but simpler, but they have notes repeated. We can see that the bird that has evolved the larger beak sings the slowest song. And this is, we would argue, a mechanical consequence of the fact that they have these beaks evolved for crushing seeds. If you do that, then you lose the ability to open and close the beak quickly. And it basically drives the structure of your song to be simple. That's about the simplest bird song that you'll hear. And then the medium ground finch is a little bit quicker. And then the small ground finch, where the beak is really, they're just eating very small grass seeds. They're less constrained. So the constraint is much greater up here. These are freed from the constraints, and that can drive their songs into specific directions.
Yeah, so all of these things are connected. So we talked earlier about how females tend to like extreme traits, things that are elaborate.
Sorry.
But I can think of a bunch of examples where the males of a species actually aren't very brightly colored or don't do these weird dances. They look just like the female does. Like in swamp sparrows, for example, the male and the female look pretty much the same. So does that kind of relate to these adaptations that are connected to each other?
Very much so. And I happen to, I'm going to rephrase your question as sort of a mystery. And so here we go. I happen to have with me a field guide to songbirds of South America. And if you happen to ever have gone down to the tropics and spent some time looking at birds, and it was the 20th century, so you didn't have your little app on your phone, this thing is called a book. If you've never seen it, you would potentially carry this with you to the field, and it has these beautiful pictures of birds. And so you might be, because this is a bird guide, and you might end up looking at a bird and saying, what is it? And then you would look into the bird guide. And so I want to show you 2 pages. The first page is a plate with different Coatengas on it. I'm not sure if you can see that. Can you see that, Katie?
A little bit.
A little bit, yeah. So you can see, for example, here are 2 different birds. One is blue, one is green. Every species of Coatenga that you look at, it has to have 2 different images involved. So here's this is a purple Coatenga, that's the male, and here's the female. Basically, in each case, you have to have a picture of the male who's usually bright and gaudy looking, and the female who looks more greenish and sort of cryptic looking. And that's very similar. We sort of saw that when we talked about the bellbird. I showed you that. So you would actually, there's a little indicator next to each of those. That's the male, that's the female. And now over here, I'm going to turn to a page of flycatchers. And if you have the guide and you see a flycatcher, you're looking at it, you see there's only one image per species. You're like, why? That's much simpler. Why do flycatchers, are they trying to make my life easier? And it turns out it's because the male and the female flycatchers look the same. So that's the mystery. Why is it that some birds, like the Coatengas, have such differences between the males and the females, whereas other species, the males and the females look almost exactly the same, which is sort of gets at the way that you phrased the question, Katie. So there's these differences, the males are not as showy. They have not evolved to be doing this fancy signaling. And the answer probably has to do, again, with the foods that they're eating. And this is an argument made by this British couple, Barbara and David Snow. And David Snow published this in a book in 1976 called The Web of Adaptation, one of my favorite books out there. And basically, he argues that if you look at the kinds of foods these birds eat, this explains why you have the evolution of brightness in one and not in the other. So let me just sort of explain this. In the Coatengas, remember, they feed on fruit. When it's time to raise babies, it's actually very easy for the mom to take care of the babies because she just has to find a fruiting tree. And if a tree is fruiting, it's got a lot of fruit. She has to just make 2 or 3 trips to that tree per day, and she can just get huge amounts of fruit. She regurgitates it to the babies, and the babies are all cared for. So the male is not needed at home. He's not required to be at home. In fact, it's probably bad for him to be at home because the main thing that kills babies of these birds is predators. And if the male shows up, he's all elaborate and conspicuous and much more likely to call the attention of predators. So he's got a lot of time on his hands. So rather than feeding babies, what he does is he spends a lot of time, hey, what am I going to do with my time? And he evolves to use that time and his energy to try to court additional females. Because since he doesn't have to take care of babies, he's freed from the responsibility. He can basically try to spread his genetic legacy by mating as often as he can, which leads to this case of, we call it sexual selection. The males compete with each other. They evolve these crazy traits, including these elaborate communication signals. And the males don't know how to dad. They're terrible dads. We can contrast that with the other kinds of species we talked about, the flycatchers, where the males and females look the same. And because of the foods they eat, the Snows argued that everything else, there's all these downstream effects are different. So basically, the male flycatcher, once he mates with the female, if he abandons the nest, the babies are going to die because they're eating small flying insects. The mom herself, I don't have a picture, but you saw one before, the females cannot collect enough food per unit time to keep the babies alive, maybe half the babies. So it's in the dad's best interest to become a good dad. He evolves to do that. He spends his time, and his brain evolves to be good at foraging and good at feeding babies. And he's a very good dad, a very good parent. He doesn't have time on his hand for hanky-panky, and there's no pressure then for him to evolve to be fancy. There's no sexual selection for him. So no need to evolve fancy dances and funny looking clothes and morphology that would push him in that direction. And it's what's amazing for me for this whole thing is that the food through these cascading effects basically changes the brain and the personality of these birds at a very high level.
Yeah, wow, this is really cool how everything is so connected like this. So we've basically run out of time here, but I do have one more quick question, and then I will take a few more questions from the audience for whoever's able to stick around a little bit. So just briefly, at the end of our cafes, we tend to like to think ahead about how we can improve science. And so one thing that I know that you can talk about, Jeff, is throughout your career, you've been doing work with a bunch of different species in different countries. And so what advice do you have mainly for other researchers for ensuring that the work of your collaborators in these other places gets appropriately acknowledged and represented?
Yeah, well, that's an important question. And in fact, I spent a lot of time worrying about that, working in the Galapagos, um, because when we were working, that's in Ecuador, we did not really have success engaging with other local researchers. And it was partly a matter of timing and partly a matter of that working in the Galapagos, you're very distant. And I began to very much worry, like, and feel like I felt kind of like, well, here I am, this American that can come down to Ecuador and pay his way with fancy American dollars. And it wasn't very satisfying. And so this is part of the personal reason why I'm very happy to have moved my focus towards working in Brazil, because it's very different there. Brazil, it's much easier to interact with students, and it has to do with the various institutions where I've worked and the fact that there are a lot of universities in Brazil and a lot of graduate students. And so this is a serious question. You know, when we're engaging with collaborators from other countries, how do we make sure that we're not just working selfishly, but we're working for the professional development of those around us? And I think the answer is that the way that I've handled it is that I've just agreed to work with these students as much as I can in terms of helping them to develop their scientific credentials. It's actually not that different than what we do in our lab, Katie, where I don't tell anybody what to do, even if we're a collaborator. I'll say, what are your interests? And we work together to try to help the student figure out what they want to do and to develop their voice. And so this involves a lot of conversation, a lot of reading. It involves me reading a lot of things that they write and giving feedback. The really hard work of doing manuscript preparation and thinking about how to push research forward, with the idea being that I'm not going to dictate what happens. And so because of this, a lot of the research has gone in directions not driven by me, but driven by collaborators, and it's actually working out quite well. It helps me to learn more than I would learn otherwise. So it doesn't feel all that different from what we do in the US. It's to try to help people develop their voice and their style.
Awesome. That's great. So with that, I'm going to just take a few more questions from the audience. So if anybody else has any last questions they'd like to hear Jeff answer, please add those to the Q&A. I'm going to start with a question from Christina, who asked, do birds think faster than people do because they have smaller brains? Can they hear faster parts of songs that we hear only when we play back their songs slowed down?
Hi, Christina. So I don't know the answer to the first part. I would love to know but I don't think that birds necessarily think quicker because they have the same neural constraints that any other animal does. Their neurons operate the same way, which is all governed by ion channels and the speed of conduction. But I do think that they have especially precisely honed acoustic processing systems. So their ears might be especially good. And it's pretty remarkable when we test birds for whether they can distinguish certain kinds of sounds. They're really, really good at detecting very subtle variations among song or calls that we ourselves might not even be able to hear as people. So I never underestimate the perceptual capacities of the critters around us. And it's very humbling when you think, for example, that something like a golden mole, this is a little mole that lives in the deserts of Namibia, that it can stick its head in the sand, and with its hearing capacity, the hearing capacity is way beyond what we can detect. They have evolved very large malleuses, which is one of the inner ear bones. They can detect the crawling of termites on grass tufts from like 50 meters away. And we can detect this with seismic detection apparatuses, but we could never imagine doing that with our own ears. And so this is one of the real fun things about actually studying animals, is recognizing that they're catching much more of the world than we ourselves personally can.
Cool. We had another question from Oren, who wanted to know, what is that thing hanging from the male bellbird and why does he have it?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that you think that thing looks awkward. So I call that a doohickey, but really probably the best name for it is the wattle, or well, the thingamajig, but we call it the wattle because there's another species. There's 4 species of these bellbirds. There's another one that lives in Central America that's actually got not only the one coming down from its beak, but coming down from each of the sides of its mouth. It's called the 3-wattled bellbird. And that must be a very peculiar existence. to have to fly around with that thing. The males have it, the females don't. So that's the big clue. It really indicates that it's for the sexual display. The females must dig it somehow for some reason.
All right, cool. And I'm going to ask one more question. So Robert wants to know, is climate change an accelerant to evolutionary pressures?
Yes, absolutely. I don't see that in any of our studies, but I think that the place where that's been seen the most has to do with coral reef biology. So coral reefs are suffering some of the quickest changes to climate change, because even slight changes to the temperature of the ocean, slight increases in the temperature, are going to have drastic effects on coral, because coral can't handle the extra acidity that's linked to that. So that it leads to bleaching of coral, and it really just devastates the communities that live in coral reefs. Actually, we've seen this a lot for things like migratory butterflies, or insects or birds, and vegetation also that lives on mountains. Because if you go up and down mountains, you have very quick, small scale changes in altitude corresponds to temperature. And as the earth gets warmer, the species that might have been adapted for a certain temperature at the lower end of the mountain now do better going up a little higher where it's cooler. And so we sort of see the migration of populations up mountains. And also geographically to higher latitudes, closer to the poles. It's amazing how much evidence there is now for the changes of the effects of climate change on the distributions of animals and their health. And that inevitably is going to affect the evolution of them, because they have to adapt to new challenges. And that's what drives evolution through natural selection.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, that's all of the questions for now. So that brings us to the end of tonight's cafe. This was a really fun one. So I want to thank Jeff for coming back again after 10 years to do another cafe for us. I also want to thank all of you in the audience who joined us tonight. Our next event is going to be next month about pollinators, and it's going to be our first bilingual cafe in both English and Spanish. So that's going to be really exciting. So you can check out our website, which should be posted in the chat for more information on that. And we hope to see you all again. So thanks again for everybody for coming.
And thanks, Katie, for emceeing.
You're welcome. See y'all next time.